The morning Maude Maddox found a stranger sleeping in her barn. She had already been awake for 3 hours, and she greeted him with a shotgun pressed to the doorframe and absolutely no patience left for surprises. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Oklahoma Territory was the kind of place that rewarded hardness and punished hesitation. The land out here near the Cimarron River stretched flat and golden and vast in every direction, cut through by dry creek beds and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees that bent in the wind like old men bowing to something they feared. Maude had lived on this edge of the territory for 7 years, and she had learned to read the land the way other women read the Bible, with reverence and with a kind of desperate need to find meaning in every sign. She was 34 years old, brown-haired and brown-eyed, with hands that had grown rough from fence posts and harvest work, and a spine that had grown straight from sheer refusal to let the world push her down any further than it already had. Her husband, Calvin Maddox, had died of a chest fever in the winter of 1874, and he had left her with 3 daughters, 40 acres of dry Oklahoma soil, 2 mules, a broken plow, and a mortgage that the bank in Guthrie seemed more than willing to remind her about each season. Her oldest daughter was Clara, who was 14 and had Calvin's stubborn jaw and her mother's quick temper. Then came Ruth, who was 11, with a gift for arithmetic that surprised everyone who met her, and a habit of explaining things to people who had not asked for explanations. The youngest was little Nora, who had just turned 7 and who followed her mother through every chore of the day like a small, devoted shadow, asking questions about everything from the color of the sky to the reason clouds moved. Maude had raised them. She had raised them without a man's help, without a man's wage, and without a man's permission. She had driven cattle to the market in Guthrie twice. She had repaired her own roof when it collapsed under a wet snow. She had planted and harvested and replanted until her arms ached so deep she could feel it in her teeth. She had done all of this quietly and determinedly, the way frontier women did things, because there was no other choice, and because her daughters were watching. So when she found the stranger curled up in the hay of her barn on that cold October morning, his hat tilted over his face and a dusty saddle sitting beside him like a loyal companion, she did not scream and she did not run. She stood in the doorframe with the shotgun resting in the crook of her arm, and she said, quite calmly, "You have until the count of 3 to tell me who you are and what you want, or I will remove your ability to tell me anything ever again." The man startled awake so fast he knocked his hat sideways. He was sitting up before his eyes were fully open, and he held his hands up instinctively, which told Maude he had been in enough situations that the gesture was a reflex. He looked at her. He blinked. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean and weathered in the way that men who lived outdoors tended to be, with dark hair that was a few weeks past needing a cut and a jaw covered in several days of dark stubble. His eyes, she noticed despite herself, were a clear and startling gray, the color of the sky just before a proper storm. "George Lawson," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "I'm George Lawson, ma'am. I wasn't meaning any harm. I rode in last night, real late, and your barn was unlocked. I knocked on the house door first twice and nobody answered. I figured I'd sleep in the barn rather than on the open ground and move along at first light." Maude looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the horse in the stall beside him, a bay gelding who was calm and well cared for, which told her something about the man's character. She looked at the saddle, which was old and repaired in several places with careful stitching. She looked at his hands, still raised, which were as calloused as hers. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Most recently, Texas," he said. "Before that, everywhere. I've been working cattle drives and ranch work since I was 16. I'm not a thief and I'm not trouble. I just needed a dry place to sleep." "What are you doing in the territory?" He lowered his hand slowly, reading her body language and deciding correctly that she wasn't going to shoot him if he moved carefully. "Looking for work," he said simply. "Winter's coming and drive season is over. I heard there were ranches and homesteads in the territory taking on hands for the cold months. I was riding toward Guthrie when it got too dark to keep on safely. Maude studied him for another long moment. She had learned in these 7 years alone to read people the way she read the land, looking for the signs that told you whether what was coming would nourish you or destroy you. She could not name exactly what it was about this man that made her lower the shotgun an inch. It was partly the horse, partly the hands, partly the steady way he held her gaze without being aggressive about it. "Can you fix a plow?" she asked. He blinked at the shift in her tone. "Yes, ma'am." "Can you mend a fence line?" "Yes." "Can you chop wood and haul water, and do it without being told twice?" Something in his expression shifted a kind of careful interest. The way a man looks when he realizes a conversation has changed direction, and he is not entirely sure where it is going, but he is willing to find out. "Yes," he said again. "I can offer you room in the barn, meals, and $3 a week," Maude said. "The work is hard, and I don't have money to waste on a man who won't pull his weight. My girls are here, and they are my concern before anything else in this world. You cause them any distress of any kind, and the shotgun comes back out. Do we understand each other?" George Lawson looked at her for a beat. Then he nodded slowly, and she could see the faintest ghost of something, not quite a smile, but related to one, passing across his face. "We understand each other perfectly, Mrs. Maddox," she said. "Maude Maddox." She turned and walked back toward the house, and she did not look back, because she had made her decision, and Maude Maddox did not second-guess herself in front of strangers. He was good at the work. She had to admit that within the first 2 days, and admitting things she had not expected annoyed her slightly, which she also had to admit. He fixed the plow on the first morning, working through the problem with a methodical patience that she found herself watching from the kitchen window more than once. He had the bent iron brace straightened and the wooden handle refitted before noon, and he did not come to the house to announce it. He simply moved on to the next task, which was the fence line along the north pasture, 3 sections of which had come down in a September windstorm and had been standing on Maude's list of things to get to for over a month. Clara watched him with the sharp, evaluating gaze of a 14-year-old who had appointed herself the protector of her family. She said nothing to him directly for the first 2 days, which for Clara was remarkable restraint. Ruth observed him with scientific curiosity, noting aloud at dinner on the first night that he tied his horse's lead rope with a knot she had not seen before, and asking her mother if she thought he would teach her it. Nora, being 7 and therefore unencumbered by any social caution whatsoever, walked directly up to George Lawson on the morning of his second day while he was splitting wood and asked him if he had ever seen a rattlesnake. Maude, who had been coming around the corner of the barn with a bucket, stopped and watched. "I have," George said, setting down the axe and giving the little girl his full attention with the seriousness that small children deserve when they ask important questions. "Several, in fact. In Texas, the biggest ones are as long as I am tall." Nora's eyes went enormous. "What did you do?" "Step back," he said, slowly. "Rattlesnakes don't want trouble any more than we do mostly. They rattle because they're scared, not because they're mean." Nora considered this with great gravity. "Mama says that about some people too," she said. "That they're not mean, just scared." George glanced up then, and he found Maude watching from around the corner, and for just a second their eyes met across the dry October air, and Maude felt something she had not felt in a very long time, a kind of startled warmth that she immediately told herself was just the cold making her grateful for the sun. She walked on without a word, swinging the bucket, and told herself to keep her mind on the cistern. The plow was fixed. The fence was mended. By the end of the first week, George had also repaired the rotting step on the porch, rehung the barn door that had been dragging on one hinge for 2 years, and cleared the brush from the east side of the property that had been threatening to crowd out the winter wheat. He worked without being asked. He worked without complaining. He came to meals when invited and did not come when he was not, and he spoke at the dinner table when spoken to, and listened the rest of the time with the quiet attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what other people had to say. Maude found this unsettling. She had expected him to be useful. She had not expected him to be good at being present. On the Saturday evening of his first week, when the girls were doing their lessons by lamplight, and Maude was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, George came and stood at the foot of the porch steps. He did not sit down without being asked. "You want to sit?" she asked, because it seemed rude to make him stand there. He climbed the 2 steps and sat on the far end of the bench from her, with a respectable distance between them that she appreciated. He had his hat in his hands and he turned it slowly, looking out at the dark sweep of the prairie. "Your land is in good shape," he said after a moment. "Better than I expected, to be honest. You've been keeping it up well." "I keep it up because I have to," she said. "That's not the same as doing it well," he said. "Plenty of people have to do things and do them badly anyway." She looked at him sideways. That was almost a compliment. "It was," he said, without any particular fuss about it. "I'm a direct man. I don't see much point in going around the long way." She turned back to the dark prairie. An owl called somewhere in the cottonwoods down by the creek, and the night insects had their steady chorus going. "How long have you been working cattle?" she asked. "Since I was 16, he said. "My father had a small ranch in East Texas. He lost it when I was 15, bad season, bad debt. He died the following year. I went to work for wages, and I've been working for wages since." "Any family?" He shook his head. "An older brother somewhere in New Mexico territory last I heard, but we lost touch years ago." He paused. "You?" "My family is in the house behind us," she said, and her voice had a finality to it that was not unfriendly. It was simply true and large and the whole shape of her world. He nodded as though he understood that, and she thought maybe he did, or was trying to. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, which surprised her. Silence with strangers was usually uncomfortable. Silence with George Lawson was, she discovered, just silence. When he said good night and walked back to the barn, she sat with her cooling coffee and looked at the stars and tried to think about the winter wheat prices, which was considerably harder to concentrate on than it should have been. October gave way to November, and the cold came rolling in off the open plains like a wall of gray intention. The first frost killed the remaining garden plants and turned the ground hard at the edges of the creek. Maude and George and the girls spent 3 full days bringing in the last of the winter preparations, stacking firewood against the side of the house, laying extra hay in the barn, checking the roof for gaps, salting and storing the smoked meat that would carry them through the coldest months. Clara had broken her silence with George sometime in the 3rd week, not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of wary respect. She had been trying to mend a section of harness leather that had cracked, and she had been fighting with it for an hour when George walked past and said, without stopping, "Warm the leather first. Dry, cold leather won't take the stitching." She had given him a sharp look and then done it, and when it worked, she had given him the smallest possible nod that could still be called an acknowledgement. Ruth had by now asked George approximately 47 questions, by Maude's estimate, about ropes and horses and cattle drives, about Texas and about the trail north, about what the Rio Grande looked like, and whether the Rocky Mountains were truly as tall as the drawings made them seem. George answered everything with patience and a kind of honest directness that Ruth clearly found deeply satisfying, because she could tell the difference between someone giving her a real answer and someone giving her a quieting one. And Nora had simply decided that George Lawson was her friend, with the absolute uncomplicated certainty of a 7-year-old, and that was that. She brought him things: a smooth creek stone, a dried wildflower, a biscuit wrapped in cloth when she thought he had not eaten enough lunch. He accepted every offering with a gravity and gratitude that somehow never felt patronizing. Watching it all, Maude felt something happening in her chest that she could not quite name and was not quite comfortable with. She had built her life very deliberately, around not needing anything that she could not provide herself. She had not had room for softness or longing, and she had been careful with herself, careful with her heart, because her daughters needed her whole and upright and functional in the mornings, and that was the most important thing. But there was something about the way George Lawson moved through her world that was making it difficult to hold to that careful management. He did not push. He did not perform. He simply was steady and present and real, in a way that the empty half of her life had been making room for without her permission. One evening in mid-November, a cold rain had been hammering the roof since midday and the girls were all inside, and Maude had gone to the barn to check on the animals and found George there with a lantern, restitching the harness that Clara had repaired, improving on her work with quiet concentration. He did not hear her come in over the rain on the roof, and she stood for a moment just inside the door, watching him work in the warm circle of lantern light, his head bent and his hands moving with that precise, patient care, and she felt the thing in her chest do something she could not catch in time to stop. He looked up and saw her. He did not startle. "Just finishing this up," he said. "The stitching your girl did was good, but it needs another row to hold through real work." "I know," Maude said. She came and sat on the hay bale across from him. "She's learning." "She's capable," he said. "All three of them are. You've done a remarkable job with them, Mrs. Maddox." "Maude," she said before she had entirely decided to say it. It came out quietly, half swallowed by the rain. He looked up at her again. Something shifted in his gray eyes, a careful, wondering attention. "Maude," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth than it had ever sounded anywhere, and that terrified her a little. "How much longer will you need work?" she asked, pulling the conversation back to practical ground as quickly as she could. He set down the harness. He looked at her honestly, the way she was beginning to understand he looked at things when they mattered. "As long as you need someone," he said. "I'm not in a hurry to be anywhere else." The rain came harder. The horse in the stall shifted and blew softly. Maude looked at her hands in her lap and thought about what it meant to need someone, and whether she had the room for it, and whether the room had already been made, whether she wanted it or not. "The bank in Guthrie is coming in the spring," she said. "For the mortgage review. I'm 2 seasons behind on the full payment. I've been making partial payments and they've been tolerating it, but I don't know how much longer they'll tolerate it." She did not know why she told him that. She had not told anyone that, not the preacher in town, not any of the neighboring homesteaders, not her girls, who were too young to carry that kind of weight. But she told George Lawson in the barn in the rain, and it felt, unexpectedly, like setting something heavy down. He did not offer false reassurance. He did not say it would be fine or that she should not worry. He said, "Tell me what we're working with. Land, livestock, winter wheat acreage. Let me help you think it through." And that, the steady, practical, unhurried offer of his mind alongside hers, was the thing that opened the first real crack in the wall she had spent 4 years building around herself. They spent the next hour in the barn with the rain on the roof, and George asked careful questions and Maude gave careful answers, and between them they worked out that if the winter wheat came in well and prices held, and if they sold 2 of the older cattle in the spring market rather than waiting for summer, she would be within range of making a full payment that would satisfy the bank for another year. It was not a rescue. It was a plan, and it was hers, and he had simply helped her see it clearly. When she finally stood to go back to the house, she paused at the barn door. "George," she said. His name felt deliberate in her mouth now too, she noticed. "Ma'am," he said, "old habit." "Thank you," she said, "for the thinking." "Any time," he said quietly. She walked through the rain back to her house, and she did not mind the cold so much. The town of Harmon Creek was 8 miles to the east, a small settlement of perhaps 300 souls that served the surrounding homesteads and ranches with a general store, a feed supply, a livery, a small school, and a church that doubled as a courthouse when the circuit judge came through. Maude went to town twice a month for supplies, and she had always gone alone, or sometimes with all 3 girls when they needed shoes or new fabric or their school books replaced. In December she found herself inviting George, because the wagon needed a second pair of hands and one of the mules was behaving poorly, which was the reason she told herself and which was at least partially true. The town looked at them with the kind of quiet noting that small towns do, not unfriendly but observant. Mrs. Haverford at the general store helped Maude with her order while her eyes moved between Maude and George, who was loading sacks of flour and cornmeal into the wagon bed with the easy efficiency of a man who had done heavy lifting all his life. Maude had known Agnes Haverford for 3 years and liked her, and she felt the question Agnes wasn't asking sitting between them like a third person at the counter. "He works for me," Maude said, not looking up from her list. "Of course he does," Agnes said pleasantly, and changed the subject to the price of coffee beans, which had gone up again, which was outrageous, and they agreed on that completely. George, for his part, moved through the town with an easy confidence that was neither pushing nor shrinking. He held doors for people and touched his hat and spoke when spoken to. In the feed supply, he struck up a natural conversation with old Harris Cole, who ran the largest ranch in the area and who had a reputation for sizing men up quickly and accurately. Maude was aware, from across the store, that Harris Cole seemed to find him straight and capable, because she knew what Harris Cole looked like when he approved of someone, and he was wearing that look. On the road home, with the wagon loaded and Nora sitting between them on the board because she had insisted and no one had argued effectively against it, George said, "Harris Cole mentioned there's a cattle buyer coming through in January out of Kansas City, paying premium for good winter beef. You've got 3 animals that would bring good prices." Maude thought about it. "That could pull the spring payment forward," she said. "That was my thinking," he said. Nora, seated between them, was carefully trying to braid 3 pieces of dried grass together, and not paying attention to the conversation in the way that children sometimes do not pay attention while absorbing absolutely everything. "Mr. George," she said without looking up, "are you going to stay forever?" Maude felt every muscle in her body go very still. George was quiet for a moment. He did not give the easy, reassuring non-answer. He said carefully, "That's not entirely my decision to make, Nora." Nora looked up at him. "Whose decision is it?" "Your mother's," he said, and he said it simply, without drama, but Maude felt it like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving out in all directions. She kept her eyes on the road and her hands steady on the reins, and she said nothing, because there was nothing she was ready to say, and George did not push, and the wagon rolled on through the cold December afternoon, and Nora finished her grass braid and announced that she was going to give it to Ruth, who had been asking about braiding techniques. Christmas came with a quiet grace. Maude had little to spare, but she had learned over the years to make much out of little, and the house smelled of pine boughs and cinnamon and roasting pork on Christmas morning. She had given the girls each something small but chosen, a new hair ribbon for Clara, a proper arithmetic workbook for Ruth, a small carved wooden horse that she had traded 2 jars of preserves for at the general store for Nora. She had not known what to do about George. She thought about it for 2 weeks, which was more time than she had spent thinking about any single decision in recent memory. On Christmas morning, she put a tin of tobacco and a new pair of work gloves on the barn step with a small card in her neat handwriting that said simply, "With gratitude, M." When he came in from morning chores, he found the tin and the gloves, and he stood there in the kitchen doorway of the house where she had invited everyone for Christmas breakfast, and he looked at her with those clear gray eyes and said, "You didn't have to do that," and she said, "I know," and that was all, but it was a great deal. He had, it turned out, made something. He produced it quietly, setting it on the kitchen table without ceremony. A carved wooden box, small and precise, with a hinged lid and delicate scrollwork around the edges. It was made from a piece of good cedar, the grain running in warm red-brown waves, and it was the most careful piece of woodwork Maude had held in her hands in years. "For papers," he said, "bills and documents and the like, somewhere safe to keep the things that matter." Clara was watching. Ruth was watching. Nora had already climbed up to look at the scrollwork with her nose about an inch from the lid. Maude held the box and felt the precise work of it, the time and care it represented, and she swallowed something that had risen unexpectedly in her throat. "Thank you, George," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "Merry Christmas, Maude," he said. She looked up at him across the kitchen table, and she thought that she was in serious, very serious trouble, and that it was far too late to do anything about it now. January brought the cattle buyer from Kansas City, a sharp-eyed man named Plunkett who came through Harmon Creek and paid respectable prices for good animals. George had spent 2 weeks getting Maude's 3 market cattle to their best possible condition, and Plunkett's offer was fair, not generous, but fair, which was about all you could ask from a man with a ledger. Maude negotiated for an extra $1 a head with a calm precision that made Plunkett raise his eyebrows and George have to turn away to hide his expression. And she got it. With that money and the careful accounting they had done together in November, she wrote to the bank in Guthrie and enclosed a payment that was the first full installment she had made in 2 years. The letter she wrote to accompany it was crisp and businesslike, and when she read it back she was satisfied with it, and she set it in the cedar box George had made while she sealed the envelope. He was in the doorway when she turned around, having come in from the cold and not wanted to interrupt. Had not heard him over the wind. "Got it sent?" he asked. "Enclosed and ready for the post rider tomorrow," she said. He nodded. He was about to turn back out and she said, "George." He stopped. She looked at him in the cold gray January light coming through the kitchen window and she said, "I would not have gotten here without your help. The planning, the cattle work, all of it. I want you to know I know that." "The land is yours," he said. "The work is yours. I just helped you see what was already there." "That's not a small thing," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and there was something in his eyes that she had been watching grow over these 3 months like a slow, careful fire. Something warm and certain and patient, something that had never once been pushed at her or forced on her, that had simply been there when she looked, steady as a lantern in a window. "No," he agreed quietly. "It's not a small thing." They stood in the kitchen in the January cold and she wanted, with a sudden intensity that caught her completely off guard, to step forward. She did not. She was not ready, or she was afraid, or both, which was probably the honest answer. But she thought he saw it, the wanting and the fear together, because he was the kind of man who saw things, and he simply nodded and turned and went back out to his work and gave her the space she needed. She stood there for a long moment with her hands on the cedar box and her heart doing complicated things. February was hard. It was always the hardest month. In Maude's experience, the cold had gone on long enough to become an ache rather than a novelty. The days were short and gray, and the particular loneliness of isolation pressed itself into the corners of the house in ways she did not notice so much in the busier months. Calvin had died in February. She always felt his absence most sharply then. One night in mid-February, after the girls were in bed and the fire was burning low, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the account book open in front of her but not really reading it. George had come in for a late cup of coffee. The cold kept him from sleeping well in the barn sometimes, and she had told him months ago that he was welcome in the kitchen in the evenings, which he used occasionally and carefully, never overstaying. She did not hear him come in and did not notice him for a moment, and then she became aware that he had sat down across the table and was looking at her with a quiet concern that she had not asked for and could not refuse. "You're not looking at that book," he said. "No," she agreed. "February?" he asked, and the way he said it simply, without pity, as though February being hard was a real and legitimate thing, made her eyes sting, which annoyed her enormously. "Calvin died in February," she said. She had not said his name to George before. 4 years ago, it was fast. It was just a fever, a chest fever, and in 3 weeks he was gone. He was 40 years old. George was quiet, letting her have the words. "He was a good man," she said. He was not a careful man, he was not good with money or with plans, and the farm was never as organized under him as it has been since, and I am aware of what that says, but he was good. He was kind to me and kind to the girls, and he never once made me feel small. She paused. I miss him differently than I used to. I used to miss him and be angry. Now I just miss him. That sounds like grief doing its proper work, George said. She looked at him. Do you know anything about grief? My father, he said. My mother before that when I was very small. You spend long enough on the road alone and you learn to make some peace with it, or you don't, and the ones who don't are not easy to be around. You've made peace with it, she said. It was not quite a question. Most of it, he said. There are still mornings. She looked at him across the table. This man who had come into her barn 3 months ago and who had become, with a quiet inevitability that she was only now fully acknowledging, necessary to her in a way that had nothing to do with fence posts or cattle prices. He was sitting in her kitchen in the February dark with his hands around a coffee cup, and he was real and present and honest, and she was so tired of being alone in the way that a person who is never physically alone can still be completely alone inside themselves. George, she said, and her voice was very quiet. I need to ask you something honestly, and I need you to answer me honestly. Always, he said. What do you want? She asked. Not from the work, not practically. What do you want from this? Her hand made a small gesture that encompassed the kitchen, the house, herself. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, I want to be here. I want to help you keep this land, and I want to see your girls grow up, and I want to sit across a table from you in the evenings. And I want to earn enough of your trust that someday, when you're ready, I can tell you that I love you without you feeling like it's a pressure or a demand. Because it's not. It is what it is, and you can do whatever you want with it. But you asked for honest, so there it is. The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie with its cold February voice. Inside, Maude Maddox sat with the truest thing that had been said to her in years, and felt it settle into her like the first warm day after a long winter. Something she had forgotten was coming and had come anyway. I'm not ready, she said. I know, he said. But I'm less not ready than I was a month ago, she said. He smiled then, a real smile, not the careful, restrained, almost smile she usually got from him, but a real one, full and warm. And she thought it was a very good smile, and she looked away before she could get too attached to it, which she was aware was too late. That will do, he said. That will absolutely do, Maude. She went to bed that night and lay looking at the ceiling and felt something she eventually identified, with some surprise and a deep, unsteady warmth, as happiness. March came with mud and wind, and the tentative green beginnings of the winter wheat coming up in long, hopeful rows across the field. George and Maude walked the rows together one morning, checking the growth, and she was aware with every step of the deliberate pleasure of being beside him, of the way their strides fell into an easy, matched rhythm without either of them planning it. It's a good stand, he said, crouching to look at a section near the creek edge. This section got enough moisture. I was worried about it in January. I always worry about this section, she said, crouching beside him. They were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool morning air. Calvin used to say the creek drainage made it unreliable. Calvin was right about the drainage, George said. The fix would be a small berm along this edge, redirect the overflow. I can build it this week before the spring rains come. You've thought about my land more than any man has since Calvin, she said, and she meant it as an observation, but it came out as something more than that. He turned his head and they were very close, both crouched over the winter wheat, and his gray eyes were warm with the morning light in them. I think about it, he said carefully, because it matters to you, and you matter to me. She held his gaze for a breath, 2 breaths. Then she reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the soil and left it there for just a moment, deliberate, quiet, chosen, and his hand turned under hers and held it just briefly with a gentle, certain steadiness. Then she stood and he stood, and they walked the rest of the field together, and the morning was cold and clear, and the wheat was green and the land stretched wide around them, and she thought that this was what it felt like when something was beginning rather than ending. The bank letter arrived in late March, signed by a Mr. Aldrich in Guthrie, confirming receipt of the payment and noting that the account was in acceptable standing. Maude read it 3 times. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh, short and bright, the kind she had not heard from herself in years. George came in from outside and found her at the table with the letter and something bright in her expression, and he read the room correctly and said, "Good news from Guthrie." "We're clear," she said. "Current with the payment. He says acceptable standing." "Acceptable," George said, like the word tasted wrong. "Your land is in better shape than 90% of the homesteads in this territory, and the bank calls it acceptable." "It's banker language," she said. "It means they're satisfied." "It means you did it," he said, and the look in his eyes was so straightforwardly proud of her that she had to look at the letter again just to have somewhere to put her eyes. Clara came in from the yard, mud on her boots, and looked at the two of them. She had the sharpest social intelligence of the 3 girls always had, and she had been watching the shift between her mother and George with the kind of careful attention she gave to things she had not yet decided how to feel about. She looked at the letter. She looked at her mother's face. She looked at George. "What happened?" she said. "Bank's satisfied," Maude said. "We're current." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at George with a measuring directness that was entirely her mother's. "You helped her figure out how to do it," she said. "It was not quite a question." "We figured it out together," George said. Clara looked at him for another long moment, with her 14-year-old's grave assessment of the world, and then she said, "Good," and went to wash her boots, and that was the closest thing to an endorsement that Clara Maddox had ever given anyone outside her family. Spring in the Oklahoma Territory had a particular beauty that hit you like a rebuke after the hard, gray months of winter. The land going from brown to gold to green almost overnight, the sky turning a deep and astonishing blue, the cottonwood trees along the creek putting out their new leaves in a pale, shivering green that caught the light like something alive. The days lengthened and warmed, and the farm became busy in the good, purposeful way of spring planting and calving, and all the maintenance that winter had deferred. George had become, by this point, entirely woven into the fabric of their days in a way that none of them tried to pretend was just employer and hired hand. He ate all his meals at the house now. He helped Clara with the heavier stock work and talked to her, Maude noticed, as an equal, which Clara clearly appreciated enormously. He had taught Ruth the knot she had asked about in October, and 17 other knots besides, and had also taught her to identify stars, which had sparked a passionate interest in astronomy that Ruth was now pursuing with characteristic intensity. With Nora, he was simply and completely her friend. They collected interesting rocks together along the creek bank, and he had built her a small wooden box to keep them in, and she had named the box George even though he had told her she really did not have to do that. And with Maude, they were somewhere new. Not rushed, not forced, but moved along by the honest accumulation of days together. They talked freely now, not just about the farm, but about everything about the territory and its people, about the injustices that pressed hard on the settlers who had come here with nothing, and were learning that the promises of the government were as unreliable as the weather. George spoke about this with a clear-eyed honesty, about how the land that homesteaders like Calvin and Maude had staked claims on had been Cheyenne and Arapaho land not so many years before, about the cost of all this expansion measured in people and ways of life that had been erased with tremendous cruelty. Maude had thought about this herself. You could not live in the territory and avoid the evidence of it if you were willing to look. They talked about it directly, which was not something she had been able to do with many people who had too much pride in the westward story to want to examine its underside. They talked about the future. Not their future, not yet directly, but the future of the land, what it could grow, what kind of place it could be for the girls as they grew up, what opportunities might come with the territory's development into statehood, which people were already talking about, though it would not come for years. One evening in late April, the girls were all asleep and the fire had burned low, and they were sitting on the porch together with the warm spring night open all around them, and the sound of the creek and the insects and the vast dark breathing prairie, and George said quietly, looking at the stars, "I'd like to ask you something." Her heart beat a particular rhythm that she recognized. "Ask," she said. He turned to look at her. In the dim light, his face was serious and clear, and without any of the guardedness that most people carried. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," he said. "I'm not asking you to be sure. I'm asking if it would be all right with you to court you properly, to be honest with you and with your girls and with anyone who cares to observe about what my intentions are." She was quiet for a moment. The spring night moved around them. "What are your intentions?" she asked, because she needed to hear it in full. "To be here," he said, "permanently if you'll have me, to be good to you and to your daughters, to help you build what you're building. To love you, Maude, if you'll let me, in every way that a man can love a woman he respects and admires and wants nothing but good things for." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about all the careful months he had given her, the patience and the steadiness, and the way he had never once made her feel anything but capable and seen. She thought about what she was afraid of and what she was not afraid of anymore, and she tallied them honestly, the way she tallied accounts, because that was who she was. "Yes," she said. "You may court me, George Lawson." His breath came out. She had not realized he had been holding it. "Thank you," he said, and the sincerity of it was so unguarded that she felt it like warmth through her whole body. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I'm not easy." "No," he agreed, and the smile was back, that real full warm one. "You're really not. That's one of the things I love about you." She shook her head, fighting her own smile and losing. "Good night, George," she said, standing. "Good night, Maude," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice even as she went inside, and she took it with her to bed like something precious and tucked it close. She told the girls the following Saturday morning at breakfast in her direct way. She had thought about how to do it all week, and had decided that there was no better approach than simply saying it clearly and giving them room to have their feelings about it. "George has asked if he may court me," she said, setting down the coffee pot and looking at all three of her daughters. "I have said yes. I want to know how you each feel about that, and I want you to be honest, because your feelings matter to me more than anything else in this." Nora said, "Yes," immediately and so emphatically that she knocked over her cup of milk, which she then felt terrible about, and the moment was briefly derailed by mop and reassurance. Ruth, once the milk situation was resolved, said, "I've been expecting this for approximately 2 months. The probability seemed high based on available evidence." Then she went back to her biscuit with the air of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed. Clara was quiet. She was the one Maude had worried about. Clara took the longest to decide things and held the most tightly to them once she had decided. She had loved her father with a fierce loyalty that had not dimmed, and Maude understood that this was complicated for her in ways it was not complicated for the younger two. "He's good," Clara said finally, slowly, looking at her plate. "He's a good man, and he works hard, and he's fair, and he doesn't talk down to us." She paused. "He's not Papa." "No," Maude said. "He's not Papa. He would never try to be. And you are allowed to love your father and also to let someone else into our lives. Both can be true." Clara looked up. Her eyes were bright. "I know that," she said with a slightly defensive firmness that was pure self-protection and pure Clara. "I'm not against it, I just needed to say it." "I know," Maude said. "I'm glad you said it." George, when Maude told him how the conversation had gone, listened to all of it with his characteristic care. When she got to Clara's part, he nodded slowly. "I'll talk to her," he said, "not to convince her of anything, just so she knows I understand." "You don't have to," Maude said. "I know," he said. "I want to." She did not know what he and Clara said to each other, because she was not there for it. She had the strong and correct instinct to let them have it privately. But she noticed, in the days after, that something between them had settled, like a stone finding its resting place. Clara was still Clara, sharp and self-possessed, and not inclined to sentimentality. But the wariness was gone, and in its place was something more solid and more honest than easy warmth would have been. The courtship, as it unfolded through May and June, was the loveliest thing Maude had experienced in years, and she was surprised by how much she had wanted it and had not known she was wanting it. It was not the courtship of young people. It did not have that particular breathless, dizzy quality. It had something better, she thought, the quality of two people who knew themselves, who had both been tested by the world, choosing each other with their eyes open. He brought her wildflowers from the creek bank on the mornings when he had been down that way, setting them in a tin of water on the porch step without announcement. He listened to her, really listened, in the way that made her feel like everything she said was worth hearing. They rode the property boundaries together in the early mornings sometimes, before the day's work began in full, just riding and talking or not talking, and those hours were some of the most peaceful she had known. He told her about his life in real detail, the years on the trail, the ranches he had worked, the men he had known and the ones he had liked and the ones he had not. He had lived a movable, unanchored life, and she could see that the stillness of her farm, the rootedness of it, was something he was settling into with a deep and genuine relief, like a man who has been cold for a very long time finally standing by a fire. She told him things she had not told anyone, the fears she had in the night about the bank, about whether she was raising the girls well enough, about whether she had been too hard or not hard enough, about whether she had grieved properly or whether she had just packed everything down so tight that it was permanently mislaid. He did not solve these things for her. He sat with her in them, which was better. On a warm June evening, he kissed her for the first time. They had been walking down to the creek after dinner, just the two of them, and the sun was low and golden, and the cottonwood leaves were moving in a soft, warm wind, and she had turned to say something about the berm he had built along the wheat field, and he was already looking at her with that steady, serious warmth, and she stopped saying whatever she had been saying, and he said, very quietly, "May I?" And she said yes, and he kissed her gently, thoroughly, without rushing, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that took her completely apart at the seams. She stepped back after a moment and looked at him, and her heart was going at a remarkable speed, and she said, slightly breathlessly, "All right." That was yes. That was very, and she stopped because she did not have a word that covered it. He was smiling, really broadly now, more broadly than she had seen him smile, and it transformed his face, and he was handsome. She noticed helplessly, in a way that she had been carefully not noticing for months. "Agreed," he said, and she laughed. And the creek ran and the cottonwoods moved, and the sun set over the Oklahoma prairie in long gold and rose colors. And she thought that she was happy, thoroughly and cleanly and completely happy, and she held it close. He asked her to marry him in July, on a Sunday after church when they were riding home with the girls in the wagon ahead, and the two of them on horseback beside each other. He had told her that morning, when he hitched the horses, that he had something to ask her today. She had spent the church service in a state of anticipatory awareness that had made it difficult to follow the sermon, which was about patience, which she considered either fitting or ironic. They had fallen a little way behind the wagon, which was moving at a comfortable pace with Clara at the reins and Ruth talking, and Nora sitting up tall looking at the sky. The day was warm and blue and perfect. "Maude," George said. "Yes," she said before he had asked anything, and then caught herself and said, "I mean, go ahead and ask." He looked at her with all of that clear, warm, entirely certain love in his gray eyes and said, "Will you marry me? Will you let me be your husband and a presence in your daughters' lives? I don't have much to bring you in a material sense beyond my two hands and my intention to work them for you for the rest of my life, but I love you. I love who you are and how you think and how you face the world, and I would be honored and grateful every day to stand beside you." She had known what she was going to say. She had known for some time. "Yes," she said, simply and fully. "Yes, George." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and held it, and she held his back, and they rode like that through the bright July afternoon with her farm ahead of them, and her daughters in the wagon and the whole wide territory opening before them. And she thought she could breathe all the way to the very bottom for the first time in years. When they came up to the wagon and George announced it standing in his stirrups slightly, telling the girls that their mother had agreed to be his wife if they were all in agreement, Nora shrieked with joy so loudly that she startled both mules. Ruth said, "Finally," with an air of patient vindication. And Clara looked at George for a long moment and then looked at her mother and said, "I think Papa would have liked him," which cost her something to say, and Maude knew it, and she reached out and took Clara's hand and squeezed it hard. "I think so too," she said. They were married in August, in the small church in Harmon Creek, on a warm, bright morning with the whole country blazing in late summer gold. Maude wore the dress she had made over the spring, deep blue cotton with white collar and cuffs, and her hair pinned up carefully, and she was beautiful in the way that women are beautiful when they are not thinking about it, but about the person standing at the other end of the aisle. George wore his best clothes, which he had added to somewhat for the occasion, and he had shaved clean that morning, and he stood straight and still and watched her come toward him with an expression of such open, uncomplicated love that Agnes Haverford in the second pew had to look for her handkerchief. Clara stood beside her mother. Ruth and Nora sat in the first row, Ruth composed and Nora squirming with excitement. The preacher spoke the words and they said the vows, and when George slid the simple gold ring onto her finger, bought at considerable cost to his saved wages, she would learn later. He looked at her the whole time and she looked back, and whatever had been tentative or unfinished between them was made whole. After the ceremony, there was a small gathering in the yard behind the church. Plates of food contributed by the neighbors and the people of the town who had been watching Maude Maddox keep her farm and raise her daughters and hold her spine straight for 4 years, and who were genuinely glad to see her with something good. Harris Cole shook George's hand for a long time and said something to him in a low voice, and George nodded. Agnes Haverford hugged Maude and said she was deserving, and Maude said she hoped she was, and Agnes said she certainly was. They rode home in the late afternoon, the whole family of them, and the farm looked different when they pulled into the yard, or perhaps she looked at it differently, knowing now that she was not looking at it alone. That evening, after the girls were settled, she and George sat on the porch in the August dark, and the stars were extraordinary overhead, thick and brilliant and close in the way they only were this far from any city, and she was leaning against him with his arm around her, and the warm night air all around them, and she felt the deep-down solid quietness of a life that had found its shape. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "When I found you in the barn in October," she said, "I thought you were just going to be a useful pair of hands for a season. That is genuinely all I expected." He laughed softly, the sound of it warm in the dark. And you became entirely something else," she said, which was the truest thing she knew how to say. He held her closer. "You became something entirely else to me too," he said. "I've ridden into a lot of places in my life. I've never ridden into one I wanted to stay in, until your barn." She turned her head and kissed him, and the stars watched and the prairie breathed and the farm was quiet and hers and his and theirs. The seasons turned with a different quality now, a shared quality, the work and the weight and the goodness of it all carried between two people instead of balanced on one pair of shoulders. George brought an ease to things that Maude had not known she missed, not because he did her work for her, but because hard things are genuinely lighter when shared, and there is no philosophy around that, it is simply true. Fall came back around, the anniversary of his arrival, and he took note of it quietly one October morning over coffee, saying, "1 year ago last Tuesday I slept in your barn uninvited. And I held a shotgun on you," she said. "And you held a shotgun on me," he agreed. "Best morning of my life, in retrospect." She shook her head at him, smiling into her cup, and he watched her with a pleasure in his face that was so comfortable it had become the ordinary texture of her days, knowing that she was loved, and knowing it without doubt every morning. The winter wheat that year came in strong, stronger than the previous year, and George had built the berm along the creek edge in the spring, and it had made the difference in the problematic section. And Maude was, she allowed herself to say, proud. They had built a working farm together that was genuinely succeeding, not barely surviving, a farm that was beginning to build equity rather than debt. The bank letter in the spring had been, if not warm, at least respectful. Progress, Mr. Aldrich wrote, which was as close to a compliment as Maude expected from a bank in Guthrie. Clara turned 15 that fall, growing into herself with a seriousness and competence that made Maude and George both quietly awed by her. She had taken on the primary management of the stock records, which she maintained with meticulous care, and she had begun talking about whether there might be a way to get more education, whether the school in Harmon Creek would be enough or whether she would need to go to something further when she was older. George had engaged with this conversation earnestly and at length, investigating what was available in the territory, because he took her seriously, and because he understood that a girl like Clara with a mind like Clara's needed more than the edge of the territory could currently offer, and he was determined to help find a way. Ruth turned 12, and her astronomy obsession had led her to corresponding with a man in Kansas City who ran a small astronomical society, and who had been delighted to find a 12-year-old girl in the Oklahoma Territory who could describe the position of Jupiter with such precision. Maude had to be honest with herself that this correspondence made her both proud and faintly alarmed, in the way that raising an exceptional child does. Nora at 8 was still exactly Nora, exuberant and curious and deeply affectionate, and she had taken to following George around with the same devotion she had always shown her mother, calling him Pa by October of that first married year, which she had arrived at independently and without discussion, and which George had received with a quiet, profound emotion that he tried to conceal and failed. In the early spring of their first married year, Maude understood that she was expecting. She told George on a quiet morning in the kitchen, watching his face very carefully, and his face said everything, a great wave of joy and a great wave of tenderness and perhaps some nervousness, all of it visible in sequence and honest. "A baby," he said, like he was testing the weight of the word. "A baby," she confirmed. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her with the careful, fierce gentleness of a man who had learned in his life to hold precious things carefully, and she let herself be held, which was still sometimes the hardest thing. She was 35 and he was 36, and it was 1879, and the territory was changing around them, growing, with more homesteaders coming every season, more towns building themselves out of raw lumber and determination, and there was a world being made here with all its injustices and all its possibilities, and she was part of it now with him beside her, and the baby was part of it too. The girls received the news each in their own way. Clara gave a nod of genuine pleasure and asked careful questions about how things would be managed during the summer work season, which was so purely Clara that Maude could have wept with fondness. Ruth said the statistical likelihood of a girl was slightly higher than a boy, and she was prepared for either outcome. Nora threw her arms around Maude's middle and said she was going to teach the baby everything she knew about rocks. The baby was born on a September morning, with the particular golden dust light of early fall coming through the bedroom window, and it was a boy. A boy with George's dark hair and Maude's brown eyes, healthy and loud and thoroughly present from his first moment. George was in the room when he was born, which was not the usual arrangement, and which the neighboring woman who had come to help, Mrs. Perkins, found somewhat irregular, but Maude had wanted him there and George had wanted to be there, and Mrs. Perkins had managed her opinions admirably. When George held his son for the first time, standing in that fall light with the boy in his arms, His face had an expression on it that Maude had no word for, something beyond joy, something that had the quality of arrival, of a man who had been traveling his whole life, finally finding the place he had not known he was traveling toward. "Calvin," Maude said from the bed. She was watching George's face. "I'd like to call him Calvin, after his grandfather." George looked at her for a long moment, understanding everything in the name, the honor, the continuity, the love that did not erase but included. "Calvin Lawson," he said, and he meant it with his whole heart. "Calvin Lawson," she confirmed, and it was the right name, and it settled into place like all the right things settled, quietly, surely, without fuss. Clara, when she held her brother for the first time, looked at him with an expression that was new on her face, a softness she did not usually show, and said, "Hello, Calvin," in a voice that was almost nothing, and then she looked at her mother and the softness stayed. Ruth observed the baby with scientific interest and declared him well-formed and asked if she could record his birth date for her own records, to which no one objected. Nora held him with the solemn, concentrated care of someone entrusted with something very important, and she told him, in a serious undertone, about rocks. The autumn of 1879 was the best autumn Maude could remember. The farm was producing well, the mortgage was current, the wheat had been exceptional that year, and they were selling cattle at fair prices and putting money back. George had been talking to Harris Cole about the possibility of adding a small cattle operation. More deliberately, Cole had offered to sell them a small breeding herd at a reasonable price, recognizing quality neighbors when he found them. They were not wealthy. They had never been wealthy and did not expect to be. But they were stable, which was better than wealth in some ways, because stability was what you built a life on. On an evening in October, exactly 1 year after George had first ridden onto her property, Maude stood at the kitchen window watching him in the yard with Nora on his shoulders, and Ruth talking animatedly about something she was pointing at in the sky, and Clara walking beside him with her characteristic self-possessed calm, and Calvin in her own arms, warm and soft and smelling of milk and October air. She had not expected any of this. She had expected to survive, and to raise her daughters, and to keep the land, and that was the full scope of what she had hoped for in those long 4 years of alone. She had not expected the barn door to open on an October morning and admit George Lawson with his raised hands and his clear gray eyes and his 6 months of patience and his cedar box and his honest love. She thought about what it cost to let yourself be loved again, when the cost of loving had been so high. She thought about all the evenings she had sat on that porch and felt the weight of a world that required too much of one person. She thought about the decision, not just the day she said yes to his courtship, but the 100 small days before it when she had chosen, quietly, to remain open instead of closed. He came in from the yard and found her at the window, and he read her face with the ease of a year of marriage. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She turned to look at him, her husband in her kitchen in October in their home. "I'm thinking that I'm glad I didn't shoot you," she said. He laughed, that full, warm laugh she had married and intended to spend the rest of her life next to. He came to her and kissed her forehead and looked down at Calvin, who was sleeping in her arms with the pure, unconscious confidence of the completely loved. "I'm glad, too," he said. "Profoundly glad, Maude." She leaned against him and looked out the kitchen window at the last of the October light going golden across her fields, her wheat fields and her pastures and her 40 acres of Oklahoma territory, hard-won and held and now thoroughly, blessedly shared. The years that came after had the quality of full, good things. Clara at 16 enrolled in an expanded school program in Guthrie that George had found and helped arrange and partially funded by negotiating his own work with a Guthrie ranch for 2 seasons, supplementing the farm income for that purpose. She graduated 4 years later with the highest marks in her class and came home with her diploma and her plans, clear-eyed and ready, and Maude held that diploma in her hands and felt a pride so deep it had no bottom. Ruth's correspondence with the Kansas City Astronomical Society led, when she was 15, to an opportunity to visit and observe through the Society's telescope, and George drove her there himself in the wagon, a journey that took 3 days each way, and which Ruth described in a letter back to her mother as the most important experience of my life so far, with the caveat that this evaluation might be revised as more data became available. Maude kept the letter in the cedar box. Nora grew up laughing and kind and collected rocks and people with equal enthusiasm, and her collection of both was impressive by any standard. Calvin walked at 10 months and spoke at 13, and his first clear word was "Pa," which George received with an embarrassing degree of emotion, and which the entire family teased him about forever after with great affection. In the spring of 1882, Maude discovered she was expecting again, which surprised them both and delighted them both in equal measure. That baby was another boy, dark-haired like his father and stubborn like his mother, and they called him James, and he arrived in a November evening with a norther howling outside and warm lamplight inside, and all 3 older girls crowded into the hallway waiting. The farm had grown by then. Harris Cole's breeding herd had been the beginning of a small but solid cattle operation that George managed with the same methodical patience he brought to everything, and the wheat was supplemented by a corn crop that had done well in the new field they had broken along the north boundary. They had hired a seasonal hand, a young man named Eli, to help during the heavy work months, and the farm had graduated from survival to something that could honestly be called prosperity, modest and earned and real. In the evenings they still sat on the porch, the 2 of them, when the children were in bed and the work was done. The porch had a good roof over it now. George had built it out that first spring, and they had 2 rocking chairs that he had made in his workshop over the winter, and the view of the prairie was as vast and dark and starred as it had always been, the land unchanged even as everything on it changed and grew. "Do you ever think about riding on?" She asked him one such evening, the kind of question that had no anxiety in it anymore, only curiosity. "The way you used to, before." He rocked slowly, his coffee in his hand, looking at the prairie. "Sometimes I think about the driving," he said. "The way the land changes day to day when you're moving through it. I think there's beauty in that." He paused. "And then I look at what's here and the thinking passes pretty quickly." She smiled. "The grass is always greener," she said. "No," he said. "My grass is the right grass." He looked at her, and the lamp in the window behind them caught in his gray eyes and made them warm as fire. "You're the right grass, Maude." She shook her head at him. "That is possibly the least romantic thing you've ever said to me." "I maintain it was romantic," he said firmly. "You're wrong," she said, but she was laughing. He reached across and took her hand in his and held it, and the prairie breathed its big dark breath around them, and far out somewhere a coyote called, one long and lonesome note, and then was answered by another, and the night went on. There were hard things still, because there are always hard things. A summer drought in 1883 cost them their corn crop and bent them lean for a year, and George worked an extra season at Cole's ranch to make it up, and came home tired in the evenings but never diminished. A fever went through the children in the winter of 1884 and took 2 bad weeks in George and Maude both sleeping very little and watching very carefully, but all 4 children came through it whole. The bank in Guthrie changed ownership, and the new manager sent a letter that was more aggressive than his predecessors, and Maude wrote back a letter that Clara would later describe as magnificent in its precision, and the matter was resolved in Maude's favor. And there were the beautiful things. The year Ruth turned 17 and stood in the yard on a clear night and pointed out to George everything she knew about the sky above them, and it took an hour and a half, and he listened to all of it with complete attention and asked genuine questions. The Sunday when Calvin, at 4 years old, decided that he was going to plow, and he walked up to one of the mules and put his small hands on the mule's nose and said, "Plow," with such conviction that the mule appeared to be considering the request. The evening Nora brought home a young man from town, a sensible, decent boy named William Hale, whose father ran the feed supply, and sat him at the dinner table and watched her family receive him, and Maude caught her watching and gave her a small nod that said what it needed to say. Clara found a teaching position in Guthrie, and came home in the summers with her life full and her eyes bright and her independence worn like good clothes, fitted and right. She had not married and did not seem to be in a hurry about it, and Maude respected this entirely. George and Maude were 38 and 37 when they buried the hard years. They were 40 and 41 and 42, and the farm was strong and their children were growing and the territory was finding its shape around them, the lawlessness of the old days giving way to something more ordered, not without its own injustices and complications, but changed. Guthrie was growing into a real city. The railroad had come closer. The world was shifting underfoot, the way it always was and always would be, and you held your ground and you held your people, and you moved with what you could move with. One evening in the fall of 1885, Maude was standing at the edge of the north field in the early evening light, looking at the wheat. 7 years since George had walked through her barn door. 7 years since she had held a shotgun in the October morning and demanded a name from a stranger in the hay. She was thinking about this, and about how thin and strange the line was between one life and another, how entirely different everything could have been if she had sent him on his way that October morning, if she had not asked about the plow, if she had not trusted the horse and the hands and the steady gray eyes. He came up behind her and stood beside her, which was where he always was, and she did not need to look to know him. "Good stand," he said, looking at the wheat. "Very good stand," she agreed. They stood in the evening quiet, the wheat moving in the light wind, the sky going amber and rose, the farm behind them with its familiar sounds, a child's voice, the mule in the paddock, the windmill turning. 7 years of this. 70 years would not be enough, she thought, and she was not a person who thought in such terms easily. "George," she said. "Maude," he said. "You became something else entirely," she said. It was what she had said to him on their wedding night, the truest thing she knew, and it was truer now. He took her hand. "So did you," he said. "We both did, that's the thing about it." She leaned into him just slightly, and he put his arm around her. And the wheat moved in the October wind, the same October wind that had been moving across this land for 1,000 years before either of them arrived, and would move across it for 1,000 years after. And for this particular October, in this particular moment, it moved across them. She had raised her daughters alone on the edge of the territory, through the hard, cold years, and she had held the land and kept the name and grown something out of grief that she could be proud of. And a man had come and asked for work, and she had given it, and he had given back the things she had not known she was missing, not her strength, which was hers, and her land, which was hers, and her daughters, who were hers, but the simple, irreplaceable warmth of someone who chose to stand beside her, day after day, with his whole heart. She turned and looked at him in the amber light, her husband, her partner, the man who had slept uninvited in her barn and been honest about his hands and his intentions and his love, and she thought that the wild country around them with all its hardness and all its beauty was the right country for a love like this, big and open, and tested by weather and standing anyway, standing whole, standing good. "Come in for dinner," she said. "Right behind you," he said. And they walked back across the field toward the lights of the house, toward the sound of their children, toward the life they had built together in the hard, good country of the Oklahoma Territory, in the autumn of 1885, with everything behind them and everything ahead.